you, Chris.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Uniotopia process. It's lovely to have you all here and welcome. My name is Dr. Zoe Hope-Bolitis and I'm hosting our launch event this afternoon. Welcome all and thank you for joining us. So since this is our first event, I wanted to open up with a few thoughts on what we're actually planning to do here. And maybe it's easiest to do that through thinking about the name of the series that we're launching today, the Uniotopia process. The Uniotopia process indicates two important ideas. First, that critical university studies is about care for the university and working for a better present and better future, a utopia. Part of this series is about understanding the present, but also about parts of our pasts and futures that can change the way we think about and actually work in universities for the better. Universities are at a crossroads in terms of their civic purpose. We face external, market, government, environmental and social demands. And internally, there are challenges in management structures and the value placed on certain kinds of academic labour. The Uniotopia process then creates a space to start something new, whilst retaining the best of the old, particularly in relation to the value of academic expertise, the curation and care with matters of truth, and notions of ethics and the public good. And we'll do this by interrogation, questioning, challenging, reframing, debating, imagining, accounting, and probably arguing too. A central notion that we have in this series is that critical university studies is also really about valuing universities. The second part of the title of the process, the idea of the word process, grounds us in the moment we're in now, working things out, trying things on, focusing on the daily, monthly activity of actually doing university studies. And it's intended as a starting point, this series here, not, and to use a very neoliberal phrase here, as a conclusive audit. It's a collective piece of work with insights and effort that we can use together to make new academic practices, and indeed perhaps a new university, a Unitopia. So the process works like a chain reaction. Each session will feature a main speaker, and then there will be a more formal respondent before we open up to a live Q&A from people watching on different platforms. The main speaker will either pre-record or present their paper live in this session. And today we have a pre-recorded talk and then a live discussion afterwards. So today, is the launch event. But after today, the next session will ask the respondent from the session before to give a full paper, tagging in the next person in line as their respondent. So today we have a response from Dr. Eric Liebeck, Presidential Fellow at the University of Manchester, and he will be the next speaker in June, and we will go on and on from there. We hope that this format will create a sense of interconnection between our individual ideas about what a Unitopia is or might be, and also create a set of two-way, three-way, five-way conversations rather than a one-way stream. And this process starts today, now. So it's with great pleasure that I kick off the first event in the Unitopia series, and we are beyond excited to have a talk from Professor Christopher Newfield to get things going. But before I formally introduce him, I want to give thanks to a few people and organisations who made this series possible. Thanks go to the Independent Social Research Foundation for project assistance. I also want to recognise the efforts and talents of both Eric Liebeck and Carl Fraser in terms of producing this series and for the work that they did in dreaming up the academic college before I arrived on the scene. Hi. So they deserve much credit in taking the first steps in making this process a reality. So sincere thanks to you both for that. They'll both be on deck here today in this live launch as the producers for the series. I also want to thank you all for tuning into this live launch event and look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas after the presentation. A reminder, you can watch and submit questions via Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook. You will receive this as you submit questions into the studio, so do feel free to comment during any part of this presentation and we will get back to them in the Q&A. But last and not least, I'd like to thank and introduce our speaker for today, Professor Christopher Newfield. Chris is Director of Research at the Independent Social Research Foundation and was Distinguished Professor of Literature and American Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he taught for 30 years. Therefore, first of all, on behalf of all of England, I'd like to apologise for just how miserable the weather is on the side of the Atlantic. Chris's principal areas of research are critical university studies, critical theory, quantification studies, and the intellectual and social effects of the humanities, as well as the US cultural history before the Civil War and after World War II. He's written a trilogy of books on the university as an intellectual and social institution: Ivy and Industry, Business and the Making of the American University, 1880 to 1980, published with Duke in 2003, Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on the Middle Class, published with Harvard University Press in 2008, and more recently, The Great Mistake, How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them, with Johns Hopkins University Press in 2016. The most recent book, The Great Mistake, is a powerful and hopeful critique of the unnecessary death spiral of higher education and offers a remarkable indictment on how misguided business policies have undermined the American higher education system. As I mentioned, he's director of the Independent Social Research Foundation. The ISRF is a public benefit foundation dedicated to the promotion of new modes of inquiry and the development of interdisciplinary expertise and methods through a better understanding of social entities and processes. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris to today's launch. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Zoe. I'm really embarrassed that I have to sit here and watch a videotape of me, so I'm not going to say much now. But just like one thought, I mean, we've been rethinking universities for a long time. I mean, they've been in crisis pretty much my entire career. You know, I got my PhD at the end of the 1980s. And we know what a lot of the problems are. I mean, we certainly need to make universities cheaper and deeper. We also know that we need to make them more equitable and more just. And of course, on the day after the first anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and while we're hoping for the full recovery of London Black Lives Matter activist Sasha Johnson, we also know that we need to link universities to racial justice. We need to decolonize them. But in order to do these various things that we've been talking about for a long time, we may also need to reinvent and restart them in more fundamental ways. So I'm just very happy to be here to hash over all these possibilities with you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. And without further ado, then I think we'll play your talk and kick on with the rest of the show. Kick off, not kick on. You're right. Thanks.
Hi. Thanks, Eric. I'm really glad to be with you today, and I'm also quite happy with the project, which I think is kind of amazing. And unusual. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it works out. The university, I think it's important to realize at the start, leads a double life. And as we proceed, we're going to need to keep both of these lives in view. The university has been a servant of the state and the corporation, and also a critic of governments and corporations and capitalism, and a realm partially free of those worlds. The university created legions of imperial administrators and created the theories of disruptive innovation that justify what we've come to call neoliberal political economy. Yet the university is a tireless critic of these ideas. The university is a settler colonial institution in countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. The university produces fierce and unsparing critiques of colonialism in forms both old and new. The university is elitist and obsessed with status and selectivity. The university is class and race inclusive and is educating new generations of students of color in a quest for social equality across differences of ethnicity and every other type of identity. The university, in other words, leads a double life and has a range of good and bad effects. So it's been hard to remember the second of these lives of late, from my point of view, the positive ones, the lives of transformation, invention, and utopian possibilities. In part, this is because many people who speak for the university have compromised it within an inch of its life. They have wrongly defined the university to the public as extended and, of course, also expensive job training that offers a good return on investment. In reality, the university remains a unique institution in society, largely because of its non-commercial activities. The university teaches very hard things, ideas, histories, skills, and techniques that take years to learn. The university conducts original research, fundamental blue sky inquiry that responds to the biggest questions, to deep social needs, and to the imagination. The university connects knowledge and research skills to student identities. It helps answer the questions, what should I do? And equally urgently, the question, who am I such that I should do this? No other institution in society combines teaching hard things, basic research, and the existential dimensions of knowledge itself. So I'm interested in transforming universities, but equally, I want to protect this unique combination of individual and social benefits for the students and the scholars of the present and also the future. Okay, I'm going to present the university in relation to the future in terms of 4 possible futures that I think are within our agency and activity to create. In other words, that none of these futures are foreordained, although one seems more likely than the other because it's more familiar to us. It hasn't been decided yet, and a lot of which of these futures occur and in what combination is going to depend on the work that we do together. My own research is focused mainly on US universities, and the current policy framework in the United States is the new President Joe Biden's 3 large initiatives that will greatly expand the role of the public sector in the United States. There's a debate going on in the US about whether Biden, a traditional centrist, is sustaining the center's preference for the private sector, for market allocations of resources and the like, or in fact, rejecting these neoliberal elements. I personally think he's rejecting them. I think he's learned from the mistakes of his own centrist positions and those of the Democratic Party and is moving down a different direction. That said, Biden's plans are inadequate to the scale of the country's and the world's problems. They're still too small and they're still too partial. And yet, they amount to a breaking of the idols that have controlled both British and American public policy for the past 40 years. The new administration has, at a minimum, created a policy rupture, and we're in a conflicted and fluid situation now that could push universities down a variety of paths in the 2020s. So I'm going to discuss 4 of these, spending most of my time on a familiar one that emerges from a neoliberal status quo. I'll outline 3 other futures at the end that we have all been variously imagining. Together, these are 4 modes of future study that aren't just abstract possibilities. The idea is that they can be generated by developing along the crossing axes indicated in the slide, the y-axis vertically and an x-axis that's horizontal. Okay, the first future I'm calling fragmented decline, and it's made from a combination of privatization on the left-hand side of the x-axis and of platform on the y-axis, in which democratic deliberation, such as it is replaced with corporate managerialism, even more than it already is currently. So this is a kind of a business as usual track. It's the more or less joyless storyline of decline foretold. Inequality increases in the higher ed system in this future until we complete the segmentation process that is already quite advanced. The high tuition financial aid model continues as it is, both in the US and in the UK, where it's been in operation for about 10 years now. Student debt rises, though more slowly. Institutional debt rises also. This is happening in the UK with massive building projects, as well as in the United States. Public funding remains stagnant and ripe for cuts at the first whiff of a fiscal downturn or for other ideological reasons. So in this system, which is just kind of continuing the future we are out of the present that we now have, wealthy super premium private universities continue to do extremely well with global brands resting on the endowment wealth that has benefited from 40 years of financial asset price inflation that has been a systematic bipartisan government policy in the US and the UK and many other countries. In the United States, there are about 16 of these universities, so call them Ivy League universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, also Stanford and Duke, and a number of others, Cambridge, Oxford, to some extent UCL. There aren't as many of them in Britain, but you know which ones they are. In the US, you could also throw in wealthy liberal arts colleges, schools you may or may not have heard of, like Amherst College or Williams College, or one that I went to, Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Some of them, not so much Reed, but the ones on the East Coast, also have massive endowment wealth, the interest from which allows them to supplement the already very high tuition revenues in offering premium sort of deluxe educational services to their not very large number of students. You add up all these institutions in the US and you get schools that serve a total of at most 5% of college students. There's another group of colleges that are selective to some degree. And again, I'm using American numbers. There are about 400 of these in total. And this group of schools more or less treads water in the coming years, in the 2020s. They keep their heads above water, depending largely on regional and other factors. Is there a decent birth rate in the region? If they're in the Sun Belt, in the Southwest with warmer weather, students are more likely to come than if they're in the Northeast or in the Midwest, where there's a certain amount of drain of younger people into southern and western parts of the country. Mostly this middle group of universities in this future can attract students and manage students' costs of attendance only by reducing their own net operating funds. That is, but they have to subsidize student tuition, and so they get less money for their own operations, even as they're helping students a bit with their high tuition charges. Then there's a third group of institutions in the US. These are essentially open access, right? You apply, you get in, and that includes everyone else. And in the United States, these number 3,800. Okay, so there's 4,300 higher education institutions in the US, and 3,800 of these are non-selective. These in the current program will be funded as job training centers, or they'll be left to struggle, consolidate, or close. Okay, none of the Biden administration's plans have any real injection of new funds into four-year universities. And you may have heard about this a little bit. The main thing that he and his administration are proposing is to make 2-year community colleges free. It's kind of the US version of further education, although they're not exactly the same. I mean, the money slated for 2-year community colleges is really good. Although it's not actually enough. But the Biden policy world seems to assume, like Barack Obama's world before it, that the acute inequality in our higher education funding system has no meaningful effects on student learning and students' future lives, never mind on the lives of instructors or staff who are actually trying to work in these often very poor institutions. This assumption is quite wrong. These 3 groups of colleges in the United States produce very different levels of learning. So group 1, the rich schools, offer customized programs with lots of individual feedback, small classes, etc. Group 2 is almost 100% adjunct instruction. That is, temporary instructors, here you call it, 0-hour contracts. They get hired for 10 weeks at a time, and maybe they'll be rehired and maybe they won't. They have bad working conditions, often no office space to meet with students, etc. And there's also inadequate scaffolding, that is student services for students from diverse backgrounds who went to weaker high schools and so on. So these students, group 3 students, as I'm labeling them, learn largely with contingent or precarious instructional labor. So their instructors are very capable and skilled people. This is not knocking them, but they are not properly paid and they are not properly supported. And by that, I mean more concretely, that they're very often are teaching too many students at more than one institution to pay proper attention to any one of their students who needs a lot of feedback. The other thing that I want to say at this point, or there's two more points really about this, is that the middle group, it sounds okay, they're not in the 3,800, they're in selective schools that have more resources. But what I want to note here is that group 2 students are closer to the least well-off students than you might think in terms of what actually happens in the American public university classroom. For example, at UC Santa Barbara, where I taught for many years, about 2% of English majors, or what you would say are students that are on English, taking an English course, 2% write what we call a senior thesis, or a final dissertation, meaning that very few of UC Santa Barbara's English graduates are competitive in their academic skills with students from places like Princeton or Reed College, where senior theses are required of any student who wants to graduate. So to summarize roughly, gross inequality of resources at the sort of the teaching operational end leads to gross inequality of student learning, except for exceptional circumstances where students make an enormous effort on an individual basis. But by and large, the outcomes are quite unequal in terms of student learning. So in this status quo future, again called fragmented decline, we have premium learning at the top and limited learning in various gradations for everyone else, especially for, and here's another thing that's very strange about the US situation, for the 50% of college starters, people who begin university, who leave university without a degree. Okay, and then there's a second thing that I wanted to mention. Higher education enforces fragmentation with a specific kind of political economy, one that is devoted to racialized resource inequality. In a landmark study called Separate and Unequal, Anthony Carnevale and Jeff Stoll found that after 1995, most newly enrolled Black and Latinx students in the US attended open access institutions, while white students mostly went to selective colleges, which have much higher graduation rates. Crucially, the study correlated the racialized variation in graduation rates with large differences in instructional expenditures per student. And I'm just going to quote them for a second. The 82 most selective colleges spent almost 5 times as much, and the most selective 468 colleges spent twice as much on instruction per student as the open access students. So I gave an example of this before, just a minute ago. If you're going to an open access school, you're going to get half the resources, even though you're in some ways twice as in need of instructional resources, because you're already starting, in most cases, from an educationally deprived high school and middle school environment. Those are older data. The trend of the past 15 or 20 years is to extend resource scarcity into universities that previously had been spared. This is the story of the University of California, which is really one of the leading public research universities in the world, 235,000 students, enormous 5 medical schools. Here, the racial correlation between diversity or the diversification of the student body and the defunding of the university is unmistakable. So there's a slide that I made to investigate this, what seemed to me to be obvious as somebody who was living through this decline there. More and more of my students are students of color who are, if anything, more ambitious about their educations than the students that I'd been teaching when I first arrived in the 1990s or the 2000s. And yet, all of us who are teaching at this institution have fewer resources in order to help them. That means fewer TAs to help with intensive writing instruction and so on. So when I mapped it out, you can look at the result. There's basically a one-to-one correspondence in the decline of the white share of the undergraduate student population, which goes down steadily in the 21st century, and the decline of resources measured as a share of state personal per capita income that goes to the university. That's a measure of how much money people actually have in their pockets. So with the exception of that big hole in the middle, which is the financial crisis, the state is slowly but surely pulling money out of an institution as it becomes less and less white. And this is a sort of a textbook illustration of what we've learned to call in the last couple of years, again, even in the mainstream media, systemic or structural racism. UC resembles nearly all universities in its official dedication to access, diversity, and inclusion. It is increasingly comfortable denouncing anti-Black racism and opposing structural racism in all its forms. So this racialized defunding conflicts with higher ed's stated goal of creating a racially inclusive form of capitalism based on knowledge, innovation, and self-development, rather than on exploitation, violence, segregation, and war. And yet the contradiction disappears, a sort of a situation of functional tension rather than contradiction, when we recognize the political economy of our default neoliberal future, which is financial accumulation through social inequality. Meaning, I'm going to say more about this, the university's, the split between its official egalitarianism around race and class and its functional anti-egalitarianism in terms of how it stratifies everybody, works to give an educational justification for the social inequality that helps financial concentration. Okay, this was named a while back as plutonomy. It means a smaller share of returns to labor and a larger share for capital. This theme was made famous by Thomas Piketty's work in the previous decade. His book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, came out in 2014 in English, in which capitalism, he argues, is doing nothing more than returning to its historic norm of growing returns to asset ownership or investment faster than it grows the economy, which means faster than it's growing wages. In the US, there's a nice visualization of this aspect of our status quo future that's called the Michel wedge. And what it shows is that in the period between, say, the end of World War II in the mid-1940s and the end of the 1970s, as worker productivity increased, so did wages. In other words, workers were getting paid for their increased productivity. Often their productivity increased on the job because they learned how to do stuff better. They taught themselves new things. A lot of increased productivity is sort of worker ingenuity. But they also, in many cases, increased their productivity because they had more schooling. So they invested in their own education, became more productive, they got more wages. After 1980, this relationship is broken, and productivity increases and profits are increasing and hourly compensation is not increasing. For the majority of American workers, there has been no real increase in their wage since the mid-1970s. They barely just kept up with increase for inflation. Okay, so for workers who are increasing their productivity in part through higher education without getting paid for it, that's bad. For business and Wall Street, this gap is enormously good. It supports intensified capital accumulation. So in this first future that we have already, higher education is helping the Wall Street and not the Main Street side, or helping the city and not, helping, red wall communities. It does this by segmenting college graduates roughly into the three groups that I mentioned before. This is the functionality that I was mentioning. Graduates of top universities have a good chance of entering elite professional services, consulting, corporate law, banking and finance, and the like, the kinds of jobs where the starting wage can be, 80 to 120,000 pounds a year, and where you just keep going up from there. The half of college starters who don't finish can do a lot of white collar work from a position of employment precarity. So they have pretty good skills and they're producing value for their organization, but because they haven't completed the credential that would obligate in some informal way the organization to give them a permanent job, they can be underpaid and discarded as needed. The large group in the middle who graduate from a wide range of good but underfunded public and private universities, which expects to enter a multiracial middle class of some kind, such as that still exists, they get limited learning, which endows them with mid-level skills, which in turn entitles them now to do professional work under precarious conditions. So the university itself has pioneered economic precarity for professionals in the form of the contingent faculty system, which I mentioned before, which now forms the majority of college instructors in the United States. The university creates middle skill, in many cases still are high skill people, but then it links these upper middle skills to low and precarious wages for the majority. If offshoring broke the wage productivity bargain for blue collar workers years ago, higher education helped end it for white collar workers. It accepted economic rule over political choices, pushed competition for scarce premium places in universities rather than egalitarian allocation of educational resources, and stratified educational quality. So we talk quite a bit now about the gig economy. A key origin of it is the gig economy. Okay, so enough of this future, which we already know well enough. What I was trying to emphasize there is not that it really contradicts racial capitalism or the current political economy. This particular future and the rules of the game that we have now allows that political economy to function. So it's a default, and it's kind of still on autopilot in spite of Biden's interventions in other areas, and some of the talk in the UK about leveling up and so on. But it's not going far enough, and at the moment this one is still prevailing. Okay. There's a second possible future along with two others, and I'm going to just briefly outline these before I stop. The second one is going to call debt-free college. So here, what in the US is kind of the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren tendency, basically the abolition of student debt and free college, meaning that all tuition charges would dial back from wherever they are now, $92.50 in the UK, higher than that in a lot of public universities in the US, back down to 0. Here, that sort of tendency builds on Biden's opening to develop college for all, or a New Deal for higher education, to name just 2 projects that are going on in the United States within the sort of the left tendency of the Democratic Party. This tendency would generate debt-free university for all students. This can only happen as a practical matter through tuition-free university. The tax system would need a major adjustment to make this work, which will mean continuing major political effort. However, free college as it's currently understood, while keeping student costs low, which is good, would retain the current inequality of university resources, which is bad, since this inequality is, as already noted, is profoundly racialized, as well as unfair on economic and class terms. So in this second future, college would be cheaper, but also at least as unjust as it is today. Since lower tuition would, without major intervention, also lower revenues, the debt-free future is educationally more mediocre, and just continues to allow thousands of institutions to stay underfunded and inadequate for the needs of their students. Okay, so onward, a third possible future is funding equalized. So here, various social movements use the Biden opening to push college for all, which is part of Future 2, towards the overcoming of structural racism and class inequalities in educational resources. This would involve a new political economy for the country. It would distribute resources to achieve equality of economic inputs across different student populations, and invert those inputs according to need. So what this means is that the entire public university sector would have equal per student funding for instructional purposes, right? So that means that even the universities with no endowments would be able to compete with universities that have some endowments or are in richer jurisdictions than others. And then what it would also do is offer a supplement to institutions that have more at-risk students who require additional services. There's a version of this that actually works in France, although not on the university level, but on the primary and secondary level, where institutions that function in disadvantaged sectors have more per student resources, because each individual student needs more attention than well-off students who already basically can kind of skate along. So the explicit goal in this future is another kind of equality, and that is equality of educational outcomes. It would use the tax system to redress injustices of income distribution, injustices that reflect the historic interaction of settler, colonial, imperial histories, and also neoliberal histories. These are 2 sort of modes of accumulation that have not sort of operated in parallel and separately, but have interacted throughout the histories of the US and the UK and Canada and all these countries. This future uses the tax system for more than one kind of educational reparations. It would define educational needs and budget them accordingly, rather than use today's reverse practice of establishing budget scarcity and then allotting the educational that scarcity allows. And then finally, a fourth possible future is abolitionist. I'm calling it autonomous here. And it aims to dismantle the current university in order to replace it with a fully non-capitalist and decolonized process of higher learning. Ideas about how this system would look would emerge in the process of their construction. These processes would be inspired by various combinations of decolonial and anti-racist thought, including their critiques of the epistemologies of the global north. This fourth future rests on criticism of public good theories of the social effects of higher education, as, among other things, being grounded in the land grab of colonial appropriation. The critique of neoliberalism has shown various abuses of the commons, For example, in his new book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, Devarian Baldwin shows how public universities have used their nonprofit status to support private developer control of the cities in which they operate. Given its concern about public funding as a crossroads of colonial and expropriative forces, this fourth future is unlikely to make claims on the resources of national or state tax systems. It may consist of local initiatives that reflect situated epistemologies and entangled identities. These might privilege self-organization in quasi-permanent autonomous zones. They might be, for example, unitopias. These activities are likely to take place in civil society, and they would be private in that sense. So that's why I put it on the left-hand side of the privatization commons access. But they would perhaps undo that opposition between privatization and the commons by being collectively and communally organized. They would have many models to draw on for organization, including cooperatives, freedom schools, storefront colleges, bootleg universities, and social movement services. Okay, the only thing that I want to say about this and wrapping up about the relationship between these different futures is I think it's a mistake to put these last three futures into conflict with each other, to say that 3 and 4, though they have very different emphases, to see them as going in different directions or having to work in opposition. They are different, but they are also synergistic. And the things that they critique, say in Future 3, critiquing neoliberalism in the name of the public good, and 4, critiquing colonialism without invoking the public good, and in fact seeing the public good as in some ways colonial. They are different, but they are also synergistic in seeing the way that those forms of accumulations have interacted over time. I think the same is true with the relationship between futures 2 and 3. So debt-free seems like a halfway measure, and a minute ago I presented it that way. It is, but it's also a major massive reform. It would constitute a political upheaval. It would inspire all sorts of people to do more and to do better. And the achievement of something like debt-free would lead to other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with where some combination of these 3 other futures, getting out of future 1, fragmented decline, neoliberalism, where they might go together. It would be towards higher education that is reconstructed, and towards something that I just think of as, the way that universities ought to be. So cycling back to what I said at the very beginning of this talk about these sort of the beneficial features of universities that make them unique, I've broken them out here to sort of 7 elements. The first, equality of outcomes across race and socioeconomic status, not equality of opportunity, but equality of result. The second, equality of outcomes across institutional types. So if you go to your local university, you're not going to be at a disadvantage compared to folks who go to Oxford or Cambridge or to the University of Pennsylvania or the University of Sydney. 3, BA degrees that are debt-free. It's kind of the starting point for the new future, the new system. Number 4, deep learning, the thing that universities do that training programs or even my beloved YouTube videos about how to get my keycaps on my Mac keyboard to get back on do not deliver. That is educational understanding of who one is and what one can do and what has already been established in the world of knowledge, all working together. And in order for this to happen, an educational core, an instructional core that is fully funded to do this. Number 5, self-directed research, independent, autonomous, academically free research, fully funded across all fields. So this means that the humanities, creative industries, creative arts, ethnic studies, critical race studies, the whole gamut of socially, culturally, psychologically, and artistically oriented study practices are adequately funded for them to realize their own research goals in the same way that the society already wants STEM fields, science and technology and engineering, to achieve theirs. 6, just employment or fair employment within universities. Universities should be model employers, and this means termination only for cause through an equitable process. And it means, in a sense, tenure being extended from academic staff to other kinds of staff working in the institution. And then last, but perhaps the most important for allowing these others to happen, democratized academic governance. Universities are run in an oddly top-down way. If you think about the way that universities are supposed to exemplify sort of the best that is thought and said, to quote Matthew Arnold, in a given society, it's very odd that many of them instead model some of the worst managerial practices in the society, kind of the withholding of data, unilateral decisions, lack of consultation, not using academic research practices to fully understand what the situation is and make a decision in a methodical manner, but importing external imperatives and just imposing those. So democratizing academic governance would, I think, would help instruction, it would help the quality of research, and it would certainly reduce the stress and the frustration that many academic staff currently feel, both in the United States and in Britain and in most other countries of which I'm aware. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. These features may all seem impossible, but one thing of which I can assure you is that they are in fact affordable. So the question that I'm going to leave you with is, why don't we build the features that will get us these elements? Why not governance in common? Why not faculty, staff, administrators, and students deleting authority barriers in order to work together? Why don't we install democracy in universities? Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for that amazing paper, Chris. So many different ideas there, although I felt like visually very effectively contained in that diagram. So thanks for providing that structure for our thinking.
Yeah, that's a ton of stuff. Well, where should we start?
I think that, in terms of the way this series is designed, we thought about how we can make this conversation one that has a legacy, really, and makes a sense of connection. I spoke before about the idea of having a respondent to each of these sessions, and we have Eric offering a brief response in a moment. So I think we'll go to that soon, but I do want to encourage those of you who are listening just to feel free to add any comments into the chat now, and we will get to those as well. I think I've certainly got some thoughts and questions there. I thought there was plenty of kind of interesting provocations, and that final one really of why don't we do this is one that is perhaps the question. So if anyone's got any thoughts on how or why or answers to that, feel free to post those too. Eric, do you want to pop on now and say hi?
Hello, hi. And it is an interesting format because Chris and I have already had this conversation, so we can either reproduce it now live, or we could go to the. I thought I had some good questions and you had some great responses. I would hate to miss them, but this is also an experiment, and I think part of the idea we had was, in our case, it's not a problem because we're both in the UK and we're able to do this, but that this could facilitate, someone in Australia or China in the middle of the night could send some responses. And so we're trying to think about the format in that sense. And also, hopefully, managing schedules. But we're really grateful to Chris for being a guinea pig of sorts while we work out the format.
No one has ever made me sit through a version of myself before. So
that must have been interesting.
I'm going to change everything.
Well, that must have been quite an experience, I realized. Because they say that watching yourself on screens causes depression or something like that.
Or psychosis.
I thought it was, we all thought it was brilliant. So if you don't mind maybe a little bit more, I can put on the discussion we had, hopefully get that conversation going. And again, I would really encourage everyone watching on the different platforms to throw your comments in, and then we'll ask Chris those live when we get back.
Sounds like a good plan. Thanks, Eric. And we'll look forward to hearing your response now.
Yeah. really extraordinary paper, and gives us a lot to work with as we start this series. So thank you very much for that. I think that those 4 futures, as you captured them, were really right on the money. And I think it's important to note that although the first future, which was a bit critical, that's perhaps the most likely. That's if we just keep going and don't intervene and just let neoliberalism, or this kind of zombie neoliberalism, keep going. That's what we can expect. And then it's interesting to think, well, what would be the most likely alternative is kind of the debt-free version. Then you have, you could keep going sort of like farther and farther to the left, around what would become almost like a circle. So it's also nice to think about how those kind of work together in that way. And yet, what I wanted to ask you about was something that I found throughout the argument that I saw you making, where at several points you seem to be pointing to contradictions. So things like the claim that universities are interested in racial justice and inclusion, and yet perpetuate inequality, and sort of that contradiction is kind of core, and I think increasingly present in something like critical university studies, which I'd love to hear you say more about. But it's not really something that I really very many in the academy or outside the academy want to address. It's just kind of like, well, more is better, so we'll do more of what we're doing, and that will solve the problem, without really stopping to take this step back and say, well, what is it that we're doing? And then just before I sort of turn that question to you, I also appreciated, though, that you did seem to have a real sense of valuing the university as a really unique institution that needs to be defended, that needs to be reconstructed. It's not just kind of abolish the university because it causes inequality. There is a kind of recognition of what might be called a dynamic tradition, or something that we could work with there that isn't just all bad. So could you say a bit more about that?
Well, yeah, I think the contradiction is what you get in a non-commercial institution that's fundamentally, about human development in the collective and the individual sense, that's being increasingly put on a commercial basis, and that's described to the public as primarily having commercial outcomes in the form of a better wage for the graduates, as opposed to better consciousness, bigger brain, better thought, more greater personal capabilities of emotional and social interaction, ability to deal with quantitative as well as qualitative knowledge. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we all need to do and that society needs, that is the real purpose of universities and of learning. And that there's just a constant conflict between trying to put all this non-monetary stuff in a monetary bottle. That's just, so part of this is just a mistake, right? I mean, I wrote this book called The Great Mistake, and the great mistake is to take common good, public good, non-monetary outcomes and mislabel them or misdefine them as entirely financial. So, I mean, that's where the confusion begins. Is this the society, whether it's like Tories or Republicans or Democrats or Labor, I mean, they've all kind of done this. Just saying, yeah, the main reason to go to university is to get a job and to make more money at that job. That's where we then stop understanding what actually happens in universities. And then, equally importantly, it's also where we stop understanding that society as a whole should pay for that through the tax system, rather than asking individuals to pay and go into debt in order to get this credential.
Right, and that kind of interest in quality seems to kind of be present in a way that I don't always see in anti-marketization politics. So, in a kind of anti-HE market, a lot of times it's just kind of capitalism is the problem, managerialism is the problem. So we should just get rid of those and open up the university to all. But one of the things you're pointing out in, for example, the debt-free Sanders-Warren vision is if you don't deconstruct the unequal stratified system, what you produce is more mediocre outcomes because you haven't addressed the pre-existing outcome. So you need to make the equality of outcomes the goal. Otherwise, you're just producing a kind of like a lowest common denominator type of product or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. There's sort of two things we could talk about now, and I should probably take them one at a time. One has to do with the funding model. The other one has to do with the intellectual processes that happen at universities. Maybe we'll take the latter because it's increasingly in danger with this particular conservative government. They, from my point of view, they don't really have a big economic plan. Like they don't have any better idea now than they did in 2011 about how to rebuild the northern powerhouse, and have a world-beating fishing industry and how to be a great trading nation. In terms of the detail, the free ports and stuff like this is not going to rebuild British manufacturing, drive new industries through technological innovation, or basically just give everybody a decent job, which is probably going to take government action at some point when they finally get around to doing it, which they're probably never going to do. It's not this government. So there's a lot of confusion. They're picking on these cultural issues in the same way that Americans do, right? So critical race theory as the Financial Times over the weekend covered the purging of boards, where the Minister of Culture, I'm forgetting his correct title, can basically veto the renewal of people on museum boards. They're state institutions. So this happens with this professor for Greenwich Museum, and the chair of the board is a Tory billionaire, resigned in protest in solidarity with this guy who apparently had said positive things about critical race theory or engaged in that practice at some point. As far as I know, it's still legal in Britain. Okay, so universities have academic freedom because you need, whether it's electrical engineering or art history or philosophy or surface chemistry, it absolutely does not matter what the discipline is. You need to be able to think whatever you have to think. You need to think freely. You need to go where the knowledge takes you and where your own mind takes you. And one of the things that universities do is help everybody who goes through them acquire those same skills and practices and capabilities. I say capabilities because it's not just learning how to do math or learning how to write properly, learning how to close read, or learning how to analyze legislation. It's developing the kind of the personality, the intellectual, emotional structure, the kind of identity that allows free thought, independence, strange ideas, creativity, defiance of conventional wisdom, skepticism, thinking that's not right, and not just kind of falling into line. So universities are historically offensive to the state, and their leaders have historically jealously guarded their independence from state power precisely because of what is happening now. That in a moment in which Britain needs to deal again with its imperial past, with its multiracial population, with racialized inequality and injustice, with racism that we all have to deal with, racism in the Tory party, racism in us, racism in white people, all these awkward and difficult things that require self-criticism. It's saying no, and it's roping institutions of learning, whether they're museums or universities, into soft compliance, right? So chilling out discussion of Israeli policy on the right bank, or whatever the issue is, the history of colonialism and how it continues to echo in inequality of health incomes in the United Kingdom.
Right.
So it's a sacred thing that universities do, is tell the truth. And we fail a lot, and we are also short-sighted and wrong and racist, and we have the same problems. Nonetheless, it's an institution that's dedicated to not having those problems through a labor-intensive process of cognitive overcoming, which means collective engagement. It means professors learning from their students. It means learning from the staff. It means the whole thing that has to happen in an environment that's not being distorted through political and other kinds of interventions. Right? So that's the intellectual piece I think is super important to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I was just curious about, because I was also really fascinated by the sort of 7-point plan of what universities ought to be. I think that's probably a good starting point to just get moving. And my own interest, a lot of my own interest is in democratizing academic governance, and you've done a lot at the University of California governors and so forth over the years. So you have first an experience of how academic governance works, or should I say doesn't work. But the thing I was interested in your written comments was where you said, why don't we install democracy in universities? And I sort of started to think, I sort of went through a sort of a chain of conceptual, like, what do we mean by democracy, right? So my first step was to go kind of Frankfurt School and say, well, democracy has become its opposite and is used in order to so you replace democracy with like consultation, and everything's been consulted, and yet no one's actually been involved in any decisions. But then I took it maybe a slightly less pessimistic, moved away from the hotel abyss or whatever, and then I was thinking of Schumpeter and the kind of like actually existing academic governance. And that starts to be something that I think is still not good, but at least it keeps some basis for some competing interests and faculties to get, it doesn't allow one to take over the whole institution. And then when there isn't academic governance or some constitution, then that does happen. And so I was kind of curious about whether you think that the existing constitutions that certain universities have, whether they're land-grant public universities or in Britain, there's, Oxford and Cambridge, I think, have a fairly robust academic self-governance in their constitution in ways that others don't. Whether those can be not necessarily reconstructed, but actually is the problem that academics have stopped participating in the way that those constitutions are intended, that they were intended for us to be involved in our universities. And is it something either through neoliberalism or just through our own interests in things like our own research, and we don't have time for these things, that we have essentially withdrawn and is part of the process to kind of re-engage?
Yeah, I think there's a structural component that has to be fixed also. There are, at least as I understand it, 4 different legal foundations for universities in Britain. And again, like limited knowledge, only one of them, the Oxbridge model, constitutes colleges in a way that give meaningful governance rights to their fellows. Mm-hmm. So that's the original college I think most academics would really like to see restored in some, or rebuilt, redeveloped, updated. I mean, you really have to redo it because it's also very insular in a lot of ways. I mean, for some reason, when I was in high school, I read the C.P. Snow novel, The Master, which is about electing a new master at an Oxford college. I was totally riveted by the truly sinister intensity of the utterly personal politics.
Yeah. Well, I think Snow was a Trollope scholar as well. I read a lot of Trollope about it's just like the way the church warden was chosen back in the 19th century. It's like really intense.
Yeah, so we don't want to idealize the college as, freedom for difference to finally enact democratic potentialities. It's really, but so I would say two things. Your yes and no to what you said. People don't want to engage because the situation now is really rigged. The system it's very top down. In the U.S., boards of trustees or boards of regents, and they're using the word regent advisedly in the sort of the English sense, in the royal context. They, at the University of California, they own everything. They own the parking fee in San Diego. That check goes to Oakland, 500 miles away. Nothing happens that isn't basically in their sovereign power to control. Faculty are, by a bylaw of the regents, unable to directly address a regent without directing their communication through the office of the president for transmission and, of course, refinement. So it's like it's kind of like a medieval court.
Yeah.
The chancellors, who are basically like the presidents of the individual campuses, cannot address regents in a regents meeting, even though they are required to attend these bi-monthly meetings. They cannot. It's like the same. Being the chancellor of Berkeley is like being the president of Harvard.
Sure.
They are not allowed to open their mouth unless they are called on. But they're 75 years old and they sit quietly until a regent calls on them. So there's a structural legal system there.
Yeah.
Needs to be overturned, fundamentally changed. It goes back to racist natural aristocracy ideas in the United States in the 19th century.
Right.
And I think that similar reforms need to happen here. But again, the chicken or egg thing, it's going to only happen if faculty, perhaps through the UCU, through the union, or through other means, really push to demand those kinds of changes.
Right. And so
build them out.
Yeah. And so hopefully this is something that we could do through this project, is start to think about how the faculty, the academics, can start to essentially begin this reconstruction process, because it sounds like from your talk there's a certain amount that has to come from the inside. I really like this phrase you had. I think it was deleting the authority barriers to work together. And so there's kind of like these walls or authority barriers, and you have to kind of one side has to chip. It's a bit like the Berlin Wall. One side chips on one side, and then the other kicks on the other. And so hopefully we could do that through this Unitopia process. Which again, we're also really grateful to the ISRF for and you for supporting and starting off our series.
No, it's really a pleasure to be with you on this. Let's keep talking.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you again, Chris. It feels like
all right, no more things.
We've done something with time, so that you're here, we're here, we're watching ourselves in the past, and.
I'm very glad. I need to have to watch myself in the present just to kind of chip in.
What I have learned is that I have spent way too much time by myself in this unfurnished office over the last 6 months.
For sure. Well, we'll keep it brief then. We'll wrap up with just a few questions we've had in from the comments, if that's all right, Chris. And I think, Eric, I don't know if you've got a snazzy way of bringing them up on the screen. Oh, look at that. Love it. So we had a question from Rosie Graham there, asking about the relationship between that comment you were making about Biden's kind of investment in 2-year community college schemes, offering that kind of free tuition for that program, and the sort of financing structure, I suppose, of academic work in itself, of these short-term contracts, the lack of tenure, and a question there about is the time reduction of all of these things related here? Do you think that those things are a related practice? Do you see connections between the two things, or are they kind of two sides of different problems?
Thanks, Rosie. That's a really good question. I'm not totally sure what you mean by time reduction related. So I don't know if you want to chat in or if there's some way of bringing you up. You just ask.
I suppose I would interpret that, maybe I'm wrong, but the idea of a kind of a 4-year program being reduced to 2 potentially in terms of funding, and the idea of a tenured career.
Okay. So the way that it works in the US is the 2-year degree is an associate degree, and then you go on to get a bachelor's over 4 years. So it isn't really, they're not trying to just say, okay, you get a BA in 2 years by going to community college. It's a totally different thing. But the first part of the question is really right, which is, they underfund community colleges. It's like the cheap version, cheap college, right? They pay less money, and one of the results of that is that most community colleges are close to 100% adjunct or contingent faculty on short-term contracts, meaning that you don't know in November if you're going to still be teaching in January, right? It's basically term to term to term, and nobody is trying to be horrible about this, but it's a huge money saver just to churn people in and out. And when students are told what the working conditions are of their professors, who they think are regular employees that have a real paycheck and a real mortgage or a rent that they can pay because of this middle-class job that they have of teaching, and then they're told that isn't true, they're shocked and appalled, and they are ready to go on, protest. I mean, this has happened when enough faculty talk to them. So my concern is that Biden, and this has been true of the Democratic Party for years and years, and it's also true of the Republicans, don't really think that most working class people need the full-fledged version of personal empowerment that students who can pay for it can get if they go to a sort of a well-funded university, whether it's private or public, where you spend a lot of time having guidance and personal cultivation. And I think it's classist and racist to think that the children of immigrants are less interested and also less deserving of personal growth than the suburban kids who started off with better high school degrees and go farther. So that pushing everybody into community college is a way of just avoiding having to up fund so that the entire population gets the same benefit that the middle class and the upper class just takes for granted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was definitely something that I took and we discussed when we recorded. I think it'll also link into Zoe's talk, so hopefully I can pull that thread through, and then Zoe will bring her expertise on the humanities. But I think that idea that the humanities are only for the elite and everyone else should just learn to work for
it drives me crazy.
Yeah,
it's like and I find academics often, we undermine ourselves often in this, where it's kind of, oh, isn't it elitist to study Shakespeare or something? And it's like, well, it doesn't have to be. Like, and equally, it's what you do with it, and what's the engagement with the students, I think.
I think that's a really interesting question, and it actually links to something I wanted to ask you, Chris, about your kind of disciplinary background, if that's all right, in kind of coming from literary and cultural studies, and then in many ways defining the field of critical university studies. And I just wondered, in terms of the problems you were outlining and the methodologies you were using in this talk, were pretty interdisciplinary in terms of using different kinds of data and evidence and constructing these things in the way that you did. But I wonder to what extent you feel like those challenges are ones that you approach from disciplinary thinking. I don't know if that's a horrible question to ask you at this stage in the day, but are there parts of the way you think about this that are particularly humanities oriented, that do kind of rely on the expertise that is within those disciplines, do you think?
Yeah, well, I started out in the sciences, and I as an undergraduate, and I switched to philosophy of science, which is kind of amazing, and then into literature, because literature was where society and social structure could be connected to my inner life, which I was very preoccupied by then and now. So the interest in what happens to people And the question of growth, the question of understanding of self and understanding the outside world happening together is the thing that I really love about universities, and which is also the thing that I think our discipline, literary studies, is really good at talking about. So, trying to combine, sociological approaches, a little bit of political economy around budgeting, with literary understanding of, the inner world, the psychological processes, of the importance of affect, the importance of identity, race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., as all part of an integrated package. It's the great thing that universities do, pulling that stuff together. And it's also something we can do in our, analytical frames to help talk about what the value of the university is, both to individuals and to the wider society.
Great, thank you. I think that linked into that point you made at the end there with your diagram as well, thinking about the way that these different ideas aren't necessarily always in conflict, but rather can kind of be overlapping or synergistic, that kind of plurality of perspectives there. I'm aware we've got some questions in the chat though, and I want to make sure we have time to get to those. Carl, are you going to come and ask yours live? Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I guess so. You talked quite you talked about the idea of universities becoming democratic institutions, and I think this is an idea that I'm very much in favor of. But I think it's something that isn't very much discussed. The idea that you may have some sort of voting rights or representational rights or a less hierarchical version of the university, and I just wanted to maybe ask you to unpack that a little bit further, but also to consider why that isn't something that we really debate within the university context.
Yeah, the latter question is something, 30 years in, I don't know. I can't explain it to you. Because it feels like we're simultaneously all kind of fellows, in the broad sense, where, the learning happens together, students and teachers and professors and the staff that supports us are potentially all basically on the same level interacting. And so, the professor knows more as by benefit of long-term immersion and study. But then students know all sorts of stuff that the professor doesn't know, that are, some of which is very pertinent to whatever is being discussed. And so that, the classroom is potentially a more organic community that could be used as a model for how to operate the overall institution. What's happened in both the US and Britain, and also other sort of Anglophone areas, is managerialization. And it's, in the US, I know a lot about the history of that. It started as private ownership. Private universities were the leading institutions in most places. And they had boards of trustees and they had donors, and so there's a kind of a private corporate company family business aspect that was top down, where professors were hired hands, and even if they were glorified hired hands. How that got imposed or just developed in public universities. I mean, on the one hand, I technically understand it. On the psychological side, I don't understand it at all, because it feels like faculty, professors in particular as a group, have been very passive about pulling back authority from levels of management, governing boards and vice chancellors and so on, who in some cases are very knowledgeable, in other cases are completely ignorant and make terrible decisions. And they're just allowed to do that year after year without any real kind of political contestation. So maybe the root is that in Western societies, we don't have very much confidence in the compatibility of democracy and expertise. In other words, you don't want the passengers to vote on what altitude the pilot should fly at in a transatlantic voyage. And so we kind of generalize from that to thinking that sophisticated knowledge and regular people getting really involved and having their opinion, that they're incompatible things. And we've then internalized that in knowledge institutions, which is the last place where we should think that. We should think that all these knowledgeable people can, in fact, govern their own affairs. So for me, the first step is really just trying to get professors to have more confidence in that concept of democratic knowledge, and then spreading it, bringing staff and students into that process better, and taking it from there.
And I thought that related to Sophia's question. Doesn't a commitment to equality mean that everyone has a right to an intellectual life?
Yes. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I mean, you said it really well. It's like, I would just like to stop and everybody gaze upon that statement. Universities are for 100% of the population, every single person, and every single person has a right to intellectual life. Here I am in my enthusiasm trampling on what you just said. And I say that in the classroom. I say to my I don't care what your background is. While you are here with me, you are an intellectual. They look at me like, I say what that is. It's just like it's a thinking person that uses thoughts to analyze and to resolve conflicts and issues without resorting to force. Resorting to ideas, persuasion, etc. So yes, and this is like a red wall thing or a heartland or Rust Belt. We have all these words for the polite othering of big parts of our societies as though they were not intellectual. I think that's totally wrong. So embracing the thought world and the actual thinking that everybody is engaged in our society will really help universities a lot.
Yeah, I think that really picks up on, the way in the conclusion of your lecture, you spoke about the idea of outcomes being this equitable thing, right? That the outcome of education is equitable. And I think that really links to that. We have one more question if we have time. I think there's a question from Francesca, which is picking up on that really elegant phrase, which I gather is from another book around the idea of the gig academy. But Francesca was wondering, what does the gig university mean for the drivers within the systems? I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, Chris. I made a note of one thing that you said during your talk about the idea of doing professional work under precarious conditions, which I guess connects there. But I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, it means that they're being exploited and they're given inadequate wages and inadequate security, and the value that they create is not being properly returned to them or sort of properly acknowledged by the larger institution. So it is, it's kind of the Uberization of the academy. Gary Hall in the UK and David Theo Goldberg in the US have both written about the Uberized university. And you all know what that means. The Deliveroo Academy is another way of putting it, where there's a real skill level and there's an essential service that is being provided. Education is absolutely that, as is the delivery of food for in various contexts, and the preparation of food, obviously, cooks, this whole range of care work that we are now finally, slowly, clumsily understanding as needing to be much better paid and much more securely rewarded than it is. Very much includes university teaching. These are really wealthy societies. You could see lower and middle income countries feeling like, well, they have to build up their health systems first, and starting slowly with teacher pay and that kind of thing. There's no excuse in the UK, there's no excuse in the US, there's no excuse in France for not having 100% secure teaching staffs and eliminating the gig aspect. You have a little bit of, well, I wouldn't even qualify it that way. I understand that people come and go and you need a little bit of contingency to fill the gaps, but we're talking 5%. We're not talking 55, 75, which is where it's gone in the US. So that feels to me like a place to really start with activism, connecting student fee issues and debt issues to gig teacher issues, and solving those things at the same time and not seeing them as opposed.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder, because that's also linked to what we're trying to do, I suppose, with the college, is to have some in-between space that's there's so much liminality in that precarious world that we've, as early career researchers, all just gotten used to, I think, and there's a certain, but I think we've also all experienced some of the inhumane aspects of that as well, where it's just unnecessarily precarious in a lot of ways, and all, in my view, all that it does take is for academics and universities to decide we're not going to do that to our fellow colleagues. You know, we're just going to create those structures that allow this to be a profession that people can feel secure in.
I would like to think the persuasion will do it. The history of labor relations in our various countries suggests that it requires striking and various kinds of social movement activism. Because I don't, given the poverty budgets that this conservative government has in mind for the university sector in the immediate future, the defunding of creative industry courses and so on, it's going to be hard to just persuade vice chancellors who are looking at their budgets to eliminate, zero-hour contracts or temporary contracts. So it's going to be an ensemble activity that I think is going to require the pressure of protest. And that's true in the U.S. as well. I've been having these conversations for 15 years.
Well, in your 4 fields show that, these are all separate options that could work together as well. It's not, and things like the storefront university or something that Carl and I have been working on, but also, I think to get rid of debt just as a policy position is just a clear, straightforward thing. So much to work with, and really grateful as well for you for helping us launch this.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. I think we'll call it a day on questions there for now. I do want to encourage any of you watching either live or catching this later on to get in touch if you've got any other thoughts about this programme and how it's been running. This is the first event, the launch, so we're really open to hearing from you. There's a link there to the Academic College website where you'll find a correspondence form. So do get in touch. Feel free also to just tweet us as well if you don't want to compose a full paragraph. But thank you all for joining us today. And thanks again to Chris for his fantastic set of provocations to get us started on Uniotopia and our process. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Eric, for the production and questions too. And I look forward to seeing you all next time when we'll hear from Eric as our main speaker. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.